I'm just going to give you, for those of you who are new, and I just spoke to some people who are new here, I just want to give you a sense of what is the Institute on Aging about, and how did we make our way to basically assuming leadership of this remarkable lecture series showcasing emeritus faculty. So the Institute on Aging is basically a hub of cutting-edge research on health and well-being of individuals as they move across the decades of life. So we're not the Institute of just being old. We are the Institute of the journey of aging, and we take that journey very seriously. We look outward to influences on the aging process that come from what researchers might call socio-demographic factors like class and culture, race, ethnicity. But we also look inward to influences that come from biology and genetics and neuroscience. And between those two, we examine proximal influences on people's health and well-being, such as what's going on in work and family life, their personal thoughts and feelings, their health practices and behaviors. And we do a lot of this work in the context of a major national longitudinal study of aging known as MIDAS, Midlife in the US, that has been tracking 11,000 Americans, many since 1995. So it's a big multidisciplinary study, and that's what we spend a lot of our time on. But I want to say what the sort of philosophy, a perspective that we bring to studying aging is a commitment to understanding the challenges and difficulties that people may face as they age, but importantly, understanding their strengths and their potential, which is a lifelong reality. And that's what brings us to the Eloquence and Eminence Emeritus Lecture Series. That has been around for 31 years. It's really an incredible series started by Emily Auerbach, a professor of English, who saw the rich possibilities of showcasing emeritus professors, people who have incredible talent and achievement, and we have a lot to learn from them. And so she initiated the Eloquence and Eminence series in 1993. She decided a couple of years ago that she needed to hand it off to someone else, and we had been a sponsor of it all those years, but now we have assumed active leadership in the running, orchestrating, scheduling the series. And so I want to thank all of you for coming, and I hope you will get on our mailing list. There on the table outside, there are cards there about how you can get in touch with us at the Institute on Aging if you have any feedback or questions, or if you want to offer suggestions about future speakers in this series and how we might reach more people to conduct this series. Our most recent speaker was Dr. Judith Leavitt, who gave a fabulous talk when was that, Julie? Last year. Okay, so much for my reconstruction of the past. Okay, so I just think it's absolutely wonderful that we are showcasing history in the lecture today, and we have the chair of the Department of History, Dr. Neil Kodish, here to introduce our speaker. Thank you, Neil.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor David McDonald. David has taught at UW-Madison in the Department of History from 1988 until his retirement in the summer of 2023, sort of retirement. He's still teaching a little bit for us right now. I first met David about halfway through his career, I think, at UW when I applied for a position here in African history. I'm a historian of Africa. And David was a member of that search committee, and I think it was pretty clear almost immediately after my campus visit that was part of the interview process, that David and I would get along. I think we both recognized that. And maybe for that reason, David volunteered to serve as my mentor when I eventually took up a position in the Department of History in 2005. I couldn't have asked for a better mentor and a friend and a colleague, and it really is an honor to introduce David to you today for this talk. Let me just say a few quick words about David. So during his time at UW-Madison, he taught courses in the history of modern Europe and also on the Russian Empire. He also taught courses on sports history, most notably an extremely popular seminar on baseball in collaboration with Commissioner Emeritus Alan Bud Selig, who was a history grad many years ago at UW-Madison. David's publications include books on Imperial Russian foreign policy, on sports' place in modern culture. And over the last many years, I've watched and listened to David talk about how he served as the primary editor on a 22-book collection entitled Russia's Great War and Revolution, 1914 to 1922. I'll say it again, 22-book collection. It's unbelievable. And this collection features contributions from more than 300 historians from every continent except Antarctica and Africa. I understand not having a contribution from a historian from Antarctica, but David will have to talk later about the lack of representation from Africa, which I don't understand quite as well. David is also one of the only, if not the only person I've met who is legitimately capable of teaching courses in multiple, wildly different fields of history. There was a kind of long-running, somewhat joking conversation in our department about the fact that given our geographic location, we really should be teaching Canadian history, right? We're so close to the border. It's our largest trading partner in this state, I think. Why aren't we teaching Canadian history? And whenever this came up, it always ended up with the same result. The only problem with this plan was that the only person qualified to teach Canadian history, David, was too busy teaching Russian history and sports history, and so we never actually got to teach Canadian history. And so I'm delighted today that David finally has an opportunity to teach us a little bit about Canadian history and to weave in perhaps a heavy dose of Russian history, perhaps even some sports history thrown in. So please join me in welcoming Professor David McDonald.
Well, thank you, Neil, and thank you, Carol, for that kind welcome, and my thanks to the Institute on Aging for choosing me to be eloquent, if not eminent, this afternoon. I've never thought of myself as either of those things, so thank you for the reassurance. Now, quick note, there won't be any slides. Sorry about that. And I won't be talking directly about the war in Ukraine, although there's a substantial period for questions and answers after my brief talk, and happy to entertain them there. I'm sort of parting from my usual talk structure this afternoon because this talk, the invitation, gave me a chance to think about a question I've answered to students almost every semester that I've taught Russian history, and that was about 70 of them. And they'd always ask, how did you get into Russian history? Like, my full name is David McDonald. There's not much Russian in there. A lot of Ottawa Valley and a lot of other parts of Scotland, but I grew up in what was then a pretty remote part of Canada, a place called Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. We thought it was a center, but we were often disabused of that notion. And I've always answered, I'll start with the answer when I get my remarks, but what I really wanted to do was talk about how we Russian historians of Russia, and I as an individual historian, especially of Imperial Russia, came to recast our thought over the course of the years of my career and even long before that. As the title says, I'm a Canadian Cold War kid. So I want to talk about how I got in there, and then the way I changed my thinking, or the way I've come to think about Russia, the empire, but also the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet Union. And I hope that opens up possibilities for questions from the audience. Now, what I really want to use that answer to the students for was an entree to the questions and perspectives that propelled a continuing career that originated in a classroom in Evan Hardy Collegiate Institute in Saskatoon in 1968 and led me to the University of Toronto, a long semester at Leningrad State University that I'll come back to, and finally Ph.D. work at Columbia University, which was where I got my dissertation, and from which my wife and I came to Madison in June of 1988 and have pretty much stayed here on and off ever since. And at the same, and I retired as Carol noted and as Neil noted in the summer of 23. And in the course of that trajectory, I developed different ways of understanding Russia or the Soviet Union, trying to see it on its own terms. And I'll come back to that as a theme too, because I've often felt that we have certain images of Russian in our lore, of Russia in our lore, and they're all predicated on the idea that somehow we're normal and they're not. And this is quite something you encounter quite often in the literature, is that the Russians are somehow pathological. I want to come back to that because I think there's a bigger answer to that question than amateur psychology or diagnostics. Now, but to get to thing, let's start with where the story begins, which is a Cold War kid in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Now, the Cold War was as real in Canada, and especially in our part of Canada, as it was in the US. One of the little-known secrets of the beginning of the Red Scare after World War II was that the person who revealed the existence of spy rings in the United States was actually an attaché in the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, a guy named Igor Guzienko, who went to the RCMP and told them that he was part of this whole cabal to run all these spy rings in the States and in Canada. They were fascinated, obviously, with the potential of the atomic bomb and how to get a hold of it. But more immediately, we had fallout shelters. We had the sirens. The sirens were there was one siren that was not far from where my wife's house was when she was a kid. And we also were very aware. We could go driving in the countryside and we'd see dew line installations, these radar installations to detect incoming Soviet ICBMs. But what was more sort of arresting beyond the B-52 flyovers you saw all the time was the fact that you'd see maps of where the missiles from North Dakota, the Minutemen, and the Soviet ICBMs would collide. And they were all over our part of Saskatchewan. And that was a little bit unnerving. But, we saw the Soviet Union, much like all the rest of the English-speaking world, and much of Western Europe saw them. There's a long-standing British tradition that we can see that goes back to the 1830s and 1840s, after Napoleonic Wars, of regarding Russia as the great adversary. And this was only redoubled by the presence of the Bolshevik state after 1919, 1920, and well into my childhood. I was a devotee of J.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. Mordor is just one of many dystopic states. You could talk about the Empire and the Star Wars movies that really are expressions or metaphors for the Soviet Union and for similar state orders, and that was very much that defined for us the Soviet Union as sort of the great source of expansionism, tyranny, anti-capitalism, and the like. And when I was a kid, this was all further reinforced by the person of Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, right? These are my first memories of politics and international politics, seeing him banging his shoe at the UN, or hanging out with Fidel Castro in the early 1960s when Castro was coming to the UN. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis very vividly because it was right around my birthday. It was this time of year. And just how quiet it was in our home and how concerned people were it was just dominating all the talk shows and all the noontime shows. But also the ultimate reconciliation between Kennedy and Khrushchev in Vienna. And finally Khrushchev's he did the tour of the United States, so it's its own sideshow. But the genuine commiseration that Nikita Sergeyev showed to the United States after Kennedy was assassinated. And interestingly enough, the next single event I remember is Khrushchev's being deposed in October 14th, 1964, 60 years ago next Monday. And he was a dominant figure. He embodied what seemed to be the bellicosity, the arrogance, the sort of forcefulness of the Soviet state. And it got a new layer of understanding Russia in high school. This Evan Hardy Collegiate Institute, where I took classes with the best teacher at any level I ever encountered in my academic life, a man named Gerhard Hildebrandt. Hildebrandt was part of a larger set of presences in Saskatchewan at the time, Manitoba, Alberta, the same thing. Another source for our thinking about Russia was we had 3 significant populations, actually 4, that had migrated from the Russian Empire before World War I, or who had fled the revolution. One was Ukrainians. About 1 in 9 Saskatchewanians is Ukrainian. You can still, I could go to villages in rural Saskatchewan, go into the bar, and I had long hair, and you'd hear, I understood enough Ukrainian to hear how disparaging they were being, but this was the lingua franca of a lot of rural Saskatchewan. So Ukrainians, Mennonites, and not the Amish offshoots that here, not the old school. These were all assimilated Mennonites who'd been in southern Ukraine since the 18th century, or in Mr. Hildebrandt's case, had settled just beyond the Volga, around Saratov. And he had come to Canada, though the other groups are a group called Doukhobors, spiritual, very weird split sect from Orthodoxy, whose passage had been paid to Canada from what we now call the Republic of Georgia by none other than Leo Tolstoy, because these people were ardent pacifists, ardent vegetarians, so they said ardent abstainers, a stance they honored in the breach, and known to be very demonstrative. There was a large population of Doukhobors in east central Saskatchewan, and finally a Jewish community in Saskatoon, in Regina, the capital, many of whom had come to Canada before World War I as part of a series of expulsions or else fleeing from pogroms in the Russian Empire, and had become really the commercial backbone of rural Saskatchewan, dry goods and that, but also featuring some pretty interesting families. Some of you might have heard of the Bronfmans. The Bronfmans made their fortune, which they later took to Montreal, and now to New York, by supplying the appetite for alcohol that apparently sprang up after 1919 in the United States. And the Saskatchewan, Montana, and North Dakota borders are wide open, so they did very well. Those of you who have any interest in English literary criticism or in lit, Leon Edel, very prominent critic in his generation, sort of contemporary of Northrop Frye. He is from the same town as the Bronfmans, Yorkton, Saskatchewan, which is also sort of the spiritual capital for a lot of Saskatchewan Ukrainians and for Doukhobors. So there was a presence here. But Mr. Hildebrandt had grown up across the Volga and had gotten a teacher's certificate in Orenburg in 1938. Orenburg's a western Siberian town in the Urals. And during the war, they respected the fact that he was a Mennonite. He worked as a medic, and he was captured and taken back to Germany. And his family doesn't really know what happened, except there's a possibility that one of the guards had Mennonite relatives and heard Hildebrandt praying to himself in the Mennonite dialects called Plattdeutsch, Low German, and he recognized the dialect and found a way to get him out. He marries a German woman after the war, chooses not to go to the Soviet Union, apparently, but comes to Canada, teaches woodwork, because he's a good carpenter, and then went back to school and got a language teaching certificate from Middlebury. And he was incredible. He taught us Russian language, very old school way, learning grammar, learning declensions, conjugations, in a way that we don't teach these things now. But he also, every Friday, was given over to learning Russian songs, Soviet songs, many of them, and verse. We had to memorize poems. And all of this instruction, it turns out, well, I go to Saskatchewan for a year after that. Well, I should note, by the way, that one of my classmates also ended up here at Wisconsin. And he'd been in my class since grade 4, and we graduated high school together and went very different ways. Some of you might know the name Rock Mackey, tomotherapy, very prominent medical physicist. He and I were bosom buddies right through grade 12. He was in these classes, and he'd probably agree with a lot of what I was saying about Mr. Hildebrand. We had other ways, though, of thinking about the Soviet Union. The first year we were in high school, the Soviet troops invaded Prague, invaded Czechoslovakia. One of our classmates was there with her family because there was a World Geological Conference. Her dad was a prof in geology at the University of Saskatchewan. So in many ways, we got continuing reminders of the Soviet Union, reinforcement of what we thought of the place. And this became really clearly focused, and I've actually taught a course on this, in an 8-game series pitting Canadian NHL players against Soviet so-called amateurs in a hockey series that we thought we would just walk away with, and ended up going all 8 games, and the series was only decided with 34 seconds to go in the 8th game. And the nice thing about being Canadian, our John F. Kennedy moment for a certain generation is Paul Henderson scoring that goal. But for me, it was fascinating seeing Cyrillic alphabet used, well, when we were kids, when we first learned it, we'd write obscenities on the board in Cyrillic, giggling because nobody else could read them, right? It was like a code. But seeing everyday Soviets, people dressed in, pretty shabbily, but cheering for their team. They had their own cheers and slogans. A friend of my wife's and mine, her dad was well-to-do. He took her along to be part of a 5,000-person contingent of Canadian fans in Moscow for these games. But this, to us, embodied the Cold War in many ways, partly because the Soviets claimed to be amateurs, but part of the reason they played us so closely and got us so close was they trained for 11 and a half months a year. If they were really good, they were drafted by the Army, and you didn't say no to, there was no draft dodging, and no deferrals and no conchies, but they all claimed to be amateurs, and which is why Canada wouldn't play in the Olympics. These guys were cheaters, and of course we didn't much like the refs either, but that's a different story. So it was very interesting to see these workaday Soviets and feeling equal passion for their teams that we felt for ours. Beyond that, it was our chance to go one-on-one with the great enemy in the thing that we were in NATO, obviously, and we played our bit, and we defended the rights of Ukrainian dissidents and later on Jewish dissidents, but we were pretty no count in the big scheme of things. This got to be our battle, our contribution, and we took great pride in that. Now, I go to the University of Toronto, ironically, because in the current situation, because I wanted to study Russian and not Ukrainian. Saskatchewan was very strong. Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, Winnipeg, 4 universities are extremely strong in Ukrainian studies, and they have that quadruplex plus University of Toronto far outweighs the presence of Ukrainian expertise in the United States, and I think that's to our shared disadvantage. But so I wanted to study Russian, and I also had 2 professional goals. Didn't want to be a doctor like my father. I wanted to be either a journalist, a foreign correspondent, or a diplomat. And so I studied, I immersed myself. I apologize in advance to any political science profs or majors because I'm not going to be very complimentary. But I immersed myself in all the theories of how the Soviet state worked, every political science course, in which the dominant model was called totalitarianism, right? The idea that there was this Leviathan state that anytime, well, Khrushchev didn't, he was retired by that time, it didn't matter whether he twitched his eyebrow or not, but Brezhnev had majestic eyebrows. And if he twitched them, you knew that something was going to happen. And we learned about all the ways that the Soviet state sort of engulfed, didn't devour, but manipulated, exploited their citizenry. And this sense of just real top-down, pervasive omnipotence that already was starting to weaken even as I was studying there in the 70s. But my life really turned around when, okay, this is how good Mr. Hildebrandt was. I took 3 years of Russian language at University of Toronto, and I was A+ in all of them. And I wasn't studying it. And I had a TA in my third year class, a woman named Esther Ryder, who was a grad student, had done her undergrad at University of Michigan. And she pulled me aside and said, "David, you're wasting your time here." "What do you mean? I'm doing okay." And she said, "Yeah, I know, but you're not learning anything. And one thing you don't really know how to do is how to speak it. And the only way you're going to do that is be able to go to the Soviet Union. And the only way you're going to get to the Soviet Union is be part of," and there was an exchange run by the Council on International Educational Exchange, and you went to Leningrad, and you roomed with Soviets, and you were there 5.5, 6 months. What was even better, University of Toronto was not on a semester system at the time, and so I was going to get no credit. But I became the only Canadian in this 30-person contingent, and I went over, and after culture shock, at just being inundated by all this Cyrillic and neon signs and banners, and hearing kids, and you go mute for a while because you can't really articulate yourself and you want to get it right. You hear these kids just declining and conjugating just like there was nothing to it, and for them there wasn't. Well, gradually started figuring things out. A friend of mine more or less got adopted by some contemporary kids our age, who took care of us, showed us around. And what I saw was just a huge number of contemporary or of contradictory phenomena to what I learned about the Soviet Union. Pervasive black market, all sorts of street gangs and violence. My family lived for a year in outside of Edinburgh, and I'd seen a fair amount of, on the terraces in the football stadium, the soccer stadium, seen a fair amount of casual violence on the part of my friends. But just things I saw in Petersburg. I was living in Toronto at the time, counterculture Toronto. The Toronto produces Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and the band, and I'm seeing just, it's almost anarchy. Pervasive drunkenness, fair amount of drug use, and a thriving black market. Some of you who would have gone to the Soviet Union might have been accosted to sell them jeans, or records, or shoes, good shoes. And what I also learned was the people who become the first generation of oligarchs after the fall of the Soviet Union, many of them had got their start as kingpins in black market networks. They were like gangs. And again, think of the Untouchables or the Godfather. The Godfather is always a good model for these types of societies. And they were originating out of Georgia and Armenia, just bringing up really good produce, good vegetables, but also really great wine, not at state prices and that. Central Asia, the hashish trade, and in some cases, opioids. I didn't see any of that, but I heard a lot about it. And then Latvia and Estonia, a lot of foreign relatives, you got foreign consumer goods. And what I also learned was there was sort of an agreement between the local party authorities and the KGB and these groups, that as long as they did not meddle in hard currency, there was a tacit recognition that they supplied a lot of consumer demand, that a military-industrial economy, such as the Soviets were, really did not have the capacity or the interest in satisfying that demand. The other thing that really stuck with me when I walked out were two parallel phenomena. One is this huge cultural and lifestyle gap between what they called the начальство, the bosses, or simply ichni, theirs, them, and nashi, our side, just the regular workaday people who were not involved in party politics, didn't really have any authority. They knew what they had to do, and they did what they did, but but they did so not grudgingly, but they didn't go overboard, most of them, to exceed the goals that they were given. But the other thing that struck me, the peril phenomenon, is there were all these spaces in which, to use a very biased way of looking at it, in which people could say what they wanted and be who they were. And they acted as sort of the end point of all these jokes that were circulating on factory floors, or anecdotes, or gossip, political gossip. They'd hide it as saying, an old lady told me, or they'd also make jokes about Radio Armenia, and use it to make political jokes. And of course, Brezhnev was the guy at the time, and I heard years afterwards, but the classic joke about him was that, and he would have been an interesting topic of study for the Institute on Aging, because he showed the effects of too little sleep, too much alcohol, and way too many cigarettes. But remember the Olympics, we didn't go to in Moscow. And he's said to have read the opening address. And he said, "Comrades, athletes, people of the world, oh, 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 oh." And his secretary says to him, "Comrade Brezhnev, you just read the Olympic logo." So there was already growing familiarity and creeping lack of respect. But for me, personally, coming back to Canada in the fall of '76, I had all sorts of questions, because totalitarian did not explain to me, like these spaces, I should explain, they say at the table or in the kitchen. These are areas where you got together with your friends. Somebody would bring some vodka, or we foreigners would bring duty-free scotch that we could get at the Bidyuaska. These were stores that catered to hard currency customers. And somebody would bring food, and you'd sit around and people would tell jokes, people would talk about movies. What was fascinating to me was they'd always watch the news. And what they watched the news for was because there'd be all these stories from the West. Say in the fall of '75, there was a lot of civil disturbances in Paris. And they're showing the footage of cops fighting students and all the rest. And my friends are looking to see what's in the windows in the shops on the squares where these riots are taking place. Oh, look at those new dresses. Oh, they're cutting the jeans differently. Oh. Or else they would listen to the BBC and Voice America, and they would record all the new pop albums that were coming out. The Beatles were the only group you could depend on finding there from Western groups, outside of people from East Germany and that the authorities didn't feel able to resist. But a lot of my friends had hours of reel-to-reel recordings of these broadcasts, and would listen to them. So there were ways of creating your own life. Plus there were networks of people. Things would fall off the back of a truck, a similar metaphor in Russian. And if you needed something, you could reach out. How am I going to get tickets to the Zenit game? How can I go to the Bolshoi if you're in Moscow? You could find them. I ran into similar networks when we lived in New York 5 years later. Now, what really struck me was we were thinking of totalitarian state as pervasive and as able to quickly react when they were confronted with dissent. But it turned out, and this is something that came to inform a lot of my later thinking about Russia, there were all these lines of interaction, but mutual agreement or tacit agreement not to get in each other's ways. And there were certain lines. You couldn't do anything public. If you walked down Soviet streets, there was one expression on the street, except for really young kids, and it'd be totally different in the kitchen or at the table. People conduct themselves a certain way, but the big red line, as I noted earlier, was really foreign currency and involving foreigners in illegal activities. And people were always mindful of that. But again, there was still this tolerance of certain types of extra state corruption and an increasing awareness among the population that the people who were them had access to services, goods, medical care, educational access that nashi or the people really didn't enjoy. And there was a growing sense that the Jesuits, they were a separate class. They were a body unto themselves. Now, the stakes were higher there. Their enforcement was relatively strict compared to, but the other line you could cross, and a lot of dissidents did this, at great personal cost and with great courage, you could challenge the state's authority publicly and directly, whether in writing, Solzhenitsyn found out, or in demonstrations in Red Square after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, as a whole generation of dissidents found out, or people like Sakharov and Sinyavsky and Daniil reaching out to foreign correspondents or sending material abroad for publication, as Pasternak did with Dr. Zhivago. So I go back to Canada, and already we're starting to see the emergence of a new approach, a little bit in poli-sci, but mainly in history. This questioning the interpretive power of this totalitarian model, because it was based on us looking at them as other, as different, as sort of politically dysfunctional or pathological, and we start seeing historians start to look for sources of social support or acquiescence to the Soviet state, or ways in which the Soviet state had to accommodate itself to certain types of, not resistance, but certain behaviors, had to acknowledge certain things. Like its predecessors, it had a very, the imperial state, in a funny way, the post-Soviet state, there is always a really interesting impulse to create the ideal subject or citizen, but create them by your own lights, that they would understand the universal imperativeness of the cause of the project you were involved in. Because for this state and its predecessor and its successor, it's this project to build the ideal order and to use state power to do it. But we see this critical approach to totalitarianism applied by looking at the very diverse groups of the population that were used in legal nomenclature, and not just ethnic and religious groups, but peasants, who were largely immobilized in the countryside by the laws under which collectivized farming worked, the urban working class that had its own mores and its own way of asserting its will. What we'd call over here working to rule, or simply taking longer at lunch, which lunch was usually 3 people on a half-liter of vodka, and daring management to do something about it. Or deals between managers in different factories to skim profits or things like that. And there were scandals occasionally to encourage others or discourage others from them. But historians started paying attention to a form of agency that was also becoming popular in histories of the global South, the idea that these populations that we'd always seen as oppressed, or the term became subaltern, they had their own ways of resisting and their own ways of getting out from under state authority. Probably one of the classic works in this genre would be James Scott, his various studies of agrarian history and social history in Southeast Asia, and his idea of the weapons of the weak. So I'm coming out of Columbia. I've decided that history deals more thoroughly with what I'm interested in than poli-sci. It demands a sort of greater immersion in a different type of source than political scientists were using. And I was starting to see that actually there are really profoundly strong links of continuity between the Russian Empire, which I was starting to study more, and the Soviet state, which I'd been studying hitherto. So I go to Columbia University, and there she's a very strong Australian anti-monarchist, so I won't call her the queen of the revisionist historians, but she's the dean of the revisionist historians, and that's what we call them, revisionists. And I went there to work with her. But then I took courses. I was taking this really brutal seminar with a guy named Leopold Hameson, who was a specialist in the late 19th century, and I started seeing affinities and sort of cross-period ties or practices that were similar on either side of the supposed divide that 1917 represented. Now, I was very interested in this idea of the spaces of sort of social existence and political authority, but also the pervasiveness of not formal legal writ and not formal bureaucratic relations, but how all these deals were made among people, informal, but tacit and governed by a very strict set of norms, whether you're talking serfs, who were as close as Russia got to slaves, agrarian serfs in the Russian countryside, and their masters, both of whom masters had an interest in peaceful villages and in productive serfs, and serfs had an interest in managers that wouldn't bother them. And you get all these strange alliances, but these extend all the way to the peak of the Russian Empire. Emperors evolved functional relationships with their senior ministers. Various political groups in Russia, in the intelligentsia, they've got their own ways of dealing as well, but they are the one problem because they fundamentally oppose the legitimacy of the Tsarist order and later of the Soviet order, and now the Putin order. Okay, and as I say, I'm happy to answer questions about that when we get in there, but I started looking for, because the dominant term in Russian history for years is the state, and the state vis-a-vis society. And this is always, it took me a while to figure this out or understand this, but, and it really upsets my Russian friends when I say this, but Soviet Union and the post-Soviet era and the imperial order were all a certain type of state, which I think of as an absolute state. You think maybe Louis XIV, but really the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Russian Empire all were driven by a notion of state authority that saw the state as a historical author, as a historical agent. And the idea was to, the state's job was, because they stood above all these petty groups in society, whether peasantry, clergy, nobles, townspeople, guildsmen, and the like, all of them could only understand the world through their own interests, what would be good for them. Whereas the state was this huge aegis that mediated among the groups and also directed them to specific tasks. In Prussia, this was, the nobles did military service, the clergy prayed, the peasants farmed, the merchants traded. So very much similar in the Habsburg Empire, and sort of similar in the Russian Empire. Thing is, Habsburg and the German states somehow straddled west and east. And by the 18th century, Russians have accepted the sentence of the West that they're part of the East and they're backwards. I always say the 18th century is when Russia learned it was backwards. And they saw their role as making a modern state and making a state that was on a par with the other states in Europe, but they wanted to do it in their way. And their way was this idea that, again, the perspective of state officials, they knew where history was going and where it was supposed to go. And they wanted to mobilize or deploy their subjects in pursuit of those goals. This is Peter the Great, this is Catherine the Great, Alexander the First. Now, you see the development of this very big bureaucracy, but a bureaucracy that still is nowhere nearly capable of managing all elements of Russian society that it wants to, and managing them the way it wants to, and getting them to comply. And there's some really interesting, there's a recent study that illustrates exactly what I mean. The guy who took my place as a historian of Imperial Russia, a guy named Jeff Durham, he's got a book coming out that is about the Russian government's efforts to impose uniform weights and measures around the empire. And we always think of the Russian Empire as just this big homogeneous mass. Well, you had the Baltic states after 1709. Each of them had their own weights and measure system. You had eastern part of what we now call Moldova. You had Ukraine, which had its own system of weights and measures. And then in the 19th century, they take over the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan. They've got their own things. And then, of course, late 18th century, they take over Poland. They've got their own measures. And even different regions have different measures. And even within the Russian Empire, with old Russia, there's all these different ways to measure. Well, there are commissions formed, laws passed, attempts to enforce them. They all come to grief. People do what they do. And this is one of these limits. It's interesting, one of these tacit limits on the exercise of authority that we assume the Tsarist government to have exercised and the Soviet government to have exercised. So in a funny way, and this I could say goes all the way back to the Varangians, the Vikings who first settled in and decided to rule Russia in the 9th to 11th century. What we see, and to me what's most fascinating, is we see states ride piggyback on informal deals that are made up and down throughout society and among different social sectors with different functions, and they'll claim superordinate authority, but they're relying on these people to do the actual governing. A great example of that is in 1740, when after her father had tried to establish direct control over the countryside through state authority. Peter the Great tries this 3 times unsuccessfully. His daughter, Elizabeth, finally says, okay, nobles, you're going to be the judges, you collect the taxes, you give us what we want, we'll leave you alone. And so you get what they call the golden age of nobility, where they basically run the main economy because of Russia's agrarian orientation at the time. So we get these states riding piggyback on local informal relations. And so it creates a really interesting, how can I put it, paradox between claims to the exercise of a certain type of legally driven state authority, because not unlike the current president, there's a real emphasis on we're a rule governed state, we're not the Ottoman Empire. One thing about being in Eastern Europe, you look farther east to find people who are truly primitive, right? And they caricature them. So we're not Turkey, we're not China. We have laws modeled on German this and that. But ultimately, what really made the system work, and whether it's the black market, whether it's serf-master relations, whether it's censorship, it was all these lower relations. And the only thing the state asked was, you make no effort to infringe on our monopoly of prerogative and of policy. That's for us. Now, there'd be backdoor discussions about what could change. And we always thought of this as pathological. We thought of it as tyrannies, the way we talked about the Germans, the way we talked about Prussians in the 18th century, the way English political philosophers would have talked about Louis XIV in the 17th century. We had this idea that we were normal, us, the Dutch, the Scots on the Sabbaths, I suppose, the Danes, Scandinavians. We were sort of the model for law governed. Well, I remember I used to speak to service clubs and I'd say, okay, how normal are we? And there'd always be a lawyer in the crowd, which was good. When was the Magna Carta? And somebody had to go up. 1215. Okay, since then, after that, there was the Wars of the Roses. There was dynastic succession. There was the English Civil War. There was the Glorious Revolution. And I'd go through, and then we get to say American Revolution, French Revolution, Civil War in the States. 1919, female suffrage, right? How long did it take for former slaves to get to vote? Well, the Signature Act is 1965, right? So that's what, I'm not a mathematician, but it looks to me like 750 years. That's how you get normal, right? So shifting gears really quickly, it's the current paradox we face for ourselves right now. The Putin state looks very much like the Soviet state and the imperial state, different drag, different languages, different approach to economic matters. Although one thing that Putin shares with Nicholas II, or Nicholas II's finance minister, is taking actually an old Daniel Defoe line, to win in a war, you've got to have the longer purse. And so the idea of generating a modern economy, and this was largely afoot in Wilhelmine Germany as well in the 19th century, the way to make yourself competitive is you see how productive capitalism is, or a certain type of industrial economy, and you just milk it, because that's more revenue for you, and that gives you more capacity. And that's, Putin was doing that with oil in the first decade of this century, and is still doing it. Those of you who read The Economist will know how hot the Russian economy is getting by all these subsidies to the defense industries and the like. But this idea that these are all instruments of statecraft, and that the only way you can pursue, and this is another constant, that Russia, the legitimacy of Russian states and the legitimacy or Russia's stature all depend on greatness. All depend on Russia's recognition as a coeval great power. Something Peter was very concerned with. It's something that Alexander I was very concerned with. And after the defeat in the Crimean War, which generated this whole set of reforms, it's something that Russian reformers cared about, something Stalin cared about in World War II, and it's something that Putin cares deeply about. And it's the one chord he can play with the population because they buy into that too. Not all of them, but an overwhelming number. Anybody outside of Petersburg and Moscow. So you've got all of these things tied up. We're always looking at Russia one way, and we're reviving these tropes nowadays. They're looking at us from their point of view. And I'm not going to defend Putin's idea that you're infringing on our territories, you're infringing on our interests by being kind to Ukraine, and you did it with Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. A very telling claim or demand from the Russian foreign minister just before the initiation of the full-scale invasion was a demand that they would only leave Ukraine alone if the West disarmed all the states that had joined NATO since 1997. So that's Lithuania, Latvia, Finland, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. That's a fair number of countries. And Ukraine's ours. Well, I can get to that in the questions and answers, but what's also striking about Russia is you've got a stratum of people that are pretty much like the people in this room, very well educated, very civically concerned. They have the idea they'd want a rule of law state. They want to have some sort of functioning, vibrant, something that looks like a democracy to us. But they've no experience with how you manage a movement, how you manage a political party, how you, who's going to collect the taxes, who's going to make sure the roads are paved. But the only thing that drives them is the sense that this is how history works. Like the fascinating thing about Russian society is a lot of people tend to think what I would say is historicistically. They see themselves embarked on this trajectory of a certain type of what they would call law-governed change and law-governed project. You just have to look around with the right eyes and you'll see it. Well, Russia's civil society is now corpuscular, just like the rest of society, and it has very little leverage with the state, as opposed to the situation before World War I. Now, they're not quite as atomized as the intelligentsia was under Stalin and Brezhnev, but they're close to that. And Navalny and the rebellions and revolutions in Ukraine both sort of focused the Russian state's attention on this. But just to bring it, I'm a bit over my time limit, I see, but only about 40 minutes. There are many ways in which the current Russia bears all the hallmarks of the societies it succeeded, or it replaced. Still a very corpuscular society. People think of themselves as belonging to very specific groups. It's very hard to reach cross-group alliances, and the state treats any sort of special pleas on part of groups as infringements on its authority. And this is something you could have seen in 1762, something you could have seen in 1825, something you could have seen in, well, the 1930s is a bit different, but 1960, and it still prevails. This absolutist vision, the idea that the state, and there's a great, I was looking for it and couldn't find it, but there's a great foreteller of Putin's politics the night, New Year's Eve, 1999, going into 2000, he has just taken over. Yeltsin had made him prime minister, the one in along, they called it the revolving door, but he was prime minister, and Yeltsin decided Vladimir Vladimirovich would succeed him. And he gives a talk, a television address on New Year's Eve, which is like Christmas and New Year's rolled into one in Russian society. And Putin says, look, we have to build democracy, we have to build a rule of law state, and goes through all this, a very reassuring agenda. But he said, but the thing is, we have to understand, we can only achieve these things under the management of a strong and authoritative state. Because that's the only agency that can bring people together and decide who goes where and does what, and mediates among them, tell them what cause they're in. And if they're doing it right, then they'll be ideal citizens. So you've got this larger historical project, and then it sounds more insidious than it is, but this idea of, how can I put it, the pedagogical state, teaching people how they ought to behave in the public interest. And so the one thing I didn't talk about that is missing in all of this is you don't, part of these crepuscular societies, you've got a very small circle of trust. When I taught these things as to undergrads, I'd say, all right, we subject ourselves and honor the authority of 9 people who in any other walk of life would long be retired. They'd be giving these talks, they'd be good subjects for study for the Institute. And we obey them, right? Like Roe v. Wade, there were certain outbursts of terrorism and there were certain excesses, but generally it was accepted, however grudgingly, as we now know. Other equally controversial findings generally commanded agreement or obedience or observance, no matter how we felt. And even the way we elect, or you guys, I don't have a vote yet, but the way representatives and senators are here, there's a certain amount of trust involved in that. One might suggest it's coming under increasing attack, but that's not my problem. That's, but in Russia and in the Soviet Union, and probably still nowadays, from what I can tell watching my friends, you know who's got a broader view if they've bought VPN. You see them, a virtual personal private network, and there's a way of getting around eyes that are interested in what you're doing. But for the most part, you never trust people you don't know. And that makes it very difficult to build the kind of public sphere that you need for some kind of functioning polity like we live in. This ability to socialize and talk, and it's become a bit more stretched in recent years, but talk about different things and talk about differences. Now, with my proclivities, I was very hopeful in the 1990s when beer became the medium of entertainment instead of vodka, which just destroys you. I was thinking, oh good, pubs will become a real public meeting place. No, everybody sits at their table and just talks with each other, doesn't want to talk with anybody else. It's like going to a bar in Toronto, actually, but that's an Eastern joke. But it's going to be really hard to establish the type of public comity and mutual trust that if you're going to make a state anything like ours, you really have to have. And from us, it was merchant. I could go on that whole history, but don't worry about it. Look, I've taken you on a longer journey from Saskatoon than you probably wanted, but I appreciate your attention, and I'd welcome any questions. And again, Ukraine war is wide open. So thank you for your attention and your time.